Good evening, all. Welcome to Religious Debate. My name is Alan Kinsey. I will be your moderator this evening. We have Joel, who is an atheist, and we have Dave, also known as Catholic Versus. A bit of a discussion on the Catholic God. I think first off, we just need to get the guys to introduce themselves. Dave, would you like to go first and just tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Catholic convert from atheism. 2009, I converted suddenly. I'd been atheist for 25 years. More and more hardcore atheist, anti-Catholic, anti-religious in general, and just suddenly converted. And it was Western philosophy that converted me, or ostensibly that's what converted me. It's hard to know really what's going on psychologically. I mean, I just might be insane. That's to be determined. But I had the conversion experience. I remember the exact moment I lost my faith at age 14, and I remember the exact moment I regained my faith in God at age 39. So I'm happily married, but I can't talk about my wife because she's anti-Catholic and she doesn't want to be dragged into my insanity. So we'll leave her out of it. Other than that, I come from a family that's ostensibly Protestant Christian. There's a church in Canada called the United Church of Canada. They've got atheist ministers now. Suffice it to say that it was sort of a liberal Protestant denomination that I ostensibly grew up with. And when I lost my faith, I just became more and more atheist. Then I converted through Western philosophy. That's sort of the short version of the story.
Thanks. That's an interesting story. We'll have to delve more into that. Well, my background is I was a missionary kid. It's Protestant Christianity. I grew up in Africa. I moved back to England when I was 16 and became very active in the church. I was a worship leader for a while, played in the worship group for a long time. And it was when I was 31, I read about evolution. And I'd been lied to by the schools I'd gone to, faith schools growing up, where they taught creationism. So then I realized if they lied to me about that, what else had they been lying to me about? And it was The Selfish Gene that I read by Dawkins. So I decided to pick up another Dawkins book, which was The God Delusion. And that led to me leaving Christianity and becoming an atheist. So that's been nearly 3 years now.
Right. Myself, I was brought up Catholic, became a reborn Christian in 82. I studied to become a pastor, and that's when I actually started reading the Bible properly and decided that there was too many ifs and buts, and I became an atheist after much studying and actually a lot of soul searching to get there, a lot of hard times, missing God. In fact, something that I loved and realized was just ingrained in me. So, that's about my little bit. So I think if you guys are ready to go on with your discussion about the Catholic God as such, David, if you'd like to go ahead and tell us what the Catholic God is actually, because look, there's a lot of gods. I mean, even the Christian gods. So the Catholic God is probably the oldest Christian God that everybody knows of. So if you'd like to go ahead.
God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This is Anselm's definition. It's Saint Anselm that actually was instrumental in converting me from atheism. I chewed on that one definition of God for 8 years, and it was actually René Descartes who tipped me over the edge into monotheism from atheism, because my atheism had sort of degraded into hard solipsism, where I thought I was the only being. Because I was reading an overview of Western philosophy, so I entered into all kinds of worldviews in terms of Western philosophy, different forms of German idealism, and I started out with the pre-Socratics, and then Socrates, Plato, and so on and so forth, always within the Western tradition. But I came upon Anselm late, and when I read his so-called proof of the existence of God, I didn't understand it, I still don't, but I chewed on it. It was like a seed planted in my heart and in my soul, in my brain, in my mind. And I just chewed on it.
I don't think I'm familiar with that one.
Oh, it's the definition that I gave you. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Right, that one.
It's deceptive in its simplicity. And to this day, there are many, many contentions in the world of philosophy. Where is the loophole? Where is the contradiction? Where is it begging the question? Where is the circular reasoning? Or is it a valid argument? People argue back and forth about it. But my point is that that is maybe not a good way to convert someone that's an atheist into monotheism. It just so happens that my particular predisposition is really cerebral and intellectual, and I just chewed on it and chewed on it and chewed on it and chewed on it. And I still don't believe that it's necessarily an airtight proof of the existence of God, but somehow by chewing on that, I came to believe. And while I was studying Western philosophy as an atheist, as an anti-Catholic, anti-Christian atheist, I was also reading the Bible, Old Testament and New, in order to mock and ridicule Christianity. And so that may have, in combination with Western philosophy, which is very, very heavily influenced by Catholic philosophy and theology, those two things combined may have been what pulled me into monotheism. But your question was, who and what is the Catholic God? The Catholic God is the first cause. It's the uncaused first cause of everything that is in creation, the natural world, the universe, my body, my soul. He is the uncaused first cause of it all. And he is the only necessary being. He is the only being whose essence is existence. So my journey to monotheism was really easy because I went through solipsism. I was confronted with my own existence, and I had to either take ownership of that and say that I am, or acknowledge that I am, but that I am only by participation, but that my essence is not existence, that there is an eternal existence of which I partake. So I consider my approach to be sort of going in through the back door using philosophy, and not just any philosophy, but solipsism, which I consider the most radical form of atheism and the most radical form of skepticism. So I think you have a lot to talk about there in response. I'll turn it over to you unless you want to prompt me with more follow-up questions.
I'm sure we'll come up with some follow-up questions. Let me just make sure I've got it right. So I've just basically taken down the short form notes of that, saying God is the greatest conceivable being, God is the first cause, and his essence is existence. Is it enough of a summary? Is there anything you needed to add to that as well?
Well, he's infinite in every perfection. This is connected with both definitions, the definition of Anselm, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and the other sort of empirical approach where we can come to God through the first cause arguments, which are arrived at through causality. We can also know with 100% rational certainty that God is infinite in every perfection. Why? Because of the principle that an effect cannot be greater than its cause. The first cause is immaterial, it's not spatial, it's not temporal, it's not composed of parts, it's not contingent. It is the uncaused cause of everything that is, and we see perfections in this world. We at least catch glimpses or hints of perfection, love, justice, beauty, goodness, and so on and so forth. And we are able to know with certainty that the source, the first cause, the supernatural first cause, is perfectly simple and is infinite in every perfection. And he is identical with all of his attributes, love, justice, peace, goodness, and so on. And those attributes are actually identical among themselves. Even though we tend to categorize things here below, we see the spectrum of the rainbow, but it all comes from that one point of white light. So it's sort of a mystical image, but here in this material, finite, created world, we can talk about pursuing justice, and we can talk about pursuing truth. And some people think that when you're pursuing one, it might be leaving the other behind, but that's not true. Even if you read Socrates and Plato, even though Socrates didn't write, but if you read the writings of Plato, they understood that when you pursue the good, you're pursuing every good, because they're all united together.
In the sense of a celestial ideal, yes. You said you were 100% certain. Is that 100% certain of the existence of the God, or is that 100% certain that if it exists, then it is perfect?
I'm 100% certain that God exists. The question is God who and what I think he is in many other peripheral ways? I don't really entertain the possibility that I am God, even though that's where I come from. I come from hard solipsism, where I thought that I was the only being. And there's a small part of me that thinks that maybe I could be drawn back into that. But for the sake of argument, we could say that either God is God or I am God. And so if God is not God, then I am God. And if I'm not God, then God is God. It's really a binary situation. But either way, you've got God, right? It's just, am I that God, or am I a creature of that God? I know it sounds insane. It is insane. But if I am God, then I've really fooled myself well. But I don't want to be God, because when I was a hard solipsist, it was very lonely. Very, very lonely. I don't know if you've experienced it. Not many people that I've met have actually experienced it. It's just, it's not a nice place to be.
I'm not entirely sure I understand hard solipsism, because the thing that always goes through my mind is a book by Ian M. Banks called Against the Dark Background, where there's an entire army of solipsists. So every time one of them dies, the rest of them think they're getting stronger because they're becoming closer to being the only physical being in the universe.
Yeah, I was not a physical being when I was a hard solipsist. I was just a disembodied intelligence, you know. It's embarrassing to talk about it, but I mean, I think it is a good exercise for any person to go through. I mean, I mentioned before the show that I do think it is possible that I'm just insane, because there's a lot of mental illness in my family. So I'm open about that. I might just be crazy, okay? But there is something about insanity and genius. There are some gray areas where you can play there. And if you look at the great artists and this sort of thing, I'm not comparing myself with them. I'm not saying I'm a genius, but I'm saying that even if I am insane and my Catholic Church teaches me that I am, there's still value to existential experiences that we have, subjective experiences we have, mystical experiences we can have. But all of this to say that the mystical, the psychological, the religious, and the intellectual, and the philosophical, to me, it's all just a wonderful realm of discovery and possibility. It's like an adventure. Now that I'm religious, obviously, there's a slight change in my outlook. Before I used to call myself a Satanist, an atheistic Satanist, just before my conversion. And it's a playful approach. And the one law of Thelema was do what thou wilt. I don't know if you've heard of this, but Aleister Crowley talked about it. Crowley actually borrowed the law of Thelema from St. Augustine. St. Augustine's version was very, very, very similar. It was love God and do what thou wilt. So they're very, very similar. And I do believe that Satanism is a really, really, really good gateway into monotheism. I think it's a shortcut. That's the way I went. I recommend it for all atheists to go deeper into their atheism, dive into it. You will end up in some sort of form of what looks like a really dark worldview, but I don't see it as dark. I don't see Satanism or solipsism as dark. I see them as just shortcuts to God, really.
So you said you're 100% confident that a God exists, but you also said that you could be that God. Where are you on balance in that term?
I'm 99.99 repeated. It's as close as you want to get to 100%. That the physical world is real. You are real. My physical body is real. And that I'm not God, that God is God. Okay? But there's that negligible but non-zero possibility that I am God. But for all intents and purposes, we can neglect it. I'm willing to neglect it.
Are there the only two options?
Yeah. Those are the only two options. Yeah. God is God or I am God.
Okay. So this God being a first cause and so on, I noticed you didn't include intelligence, agency, or anything like that in its attributes.
Sure did. I said he's infinite in every perfection.
Perfection means intelligence.
Whatever it's better to have than to not have. So circles are perfect, but it's not better to be a circle than to not be a circle. Therefore, God is not a circle. This is literally straight out of Anselm. I recommend you read it. It's very short, pithy, and to the point, and it answers a lot of questions that atheists have in a straightforward and colorful manner, and it's pretty much irrefutable. And if we acknowledge in ourselves the capacity to reason and free will and love and justice and mercy and all these perfections, we can dismiss it as some sort of Darwinian survival mechanism, but I don't think that's honest. I think that we have to meditate on the reality of these perfections, the inaccessibility of their achievement in this finite world. Why is it that people are comfortable saying the word justice when justice is never completely meted out in this world. We know that people get away with bad stuff and that the good suffer in a way that doesn't seem to be in keeping with their goodness. We know that there are lots of apparent injustices and that the accounts don't seem to be reckoned here below. And yet everyone I meet, and especially the atheists that I meet online anyway, are very self-righteous. They're very moralizing. They take the moral high ground. How dare you this? How dare God that? And their conceptions of perfection are my God. Their standard by which they judge me and my religion and the pedophile priests, that standard is my God. So they're bowing and worshiping my God all the time, 24/7. And so that's what astounds me. And this is all to answer your question about why did I not mention intelligence? Well, because it's obvious that you have intelligence, but your intelligence is not the ultimate supreme intelligence. You're participating in intelligence. You can see in yourself and in your friends and family, smart, smarter, and smartest. If there are 10 people in the room, you can point to the smartest guy in the room. But you can also take that smartest guy in this room and compare him with the smartest guy in the room next door. And so on and so forth. It's always a trajectory. We're always going to look at looking along that line. Where does it point? It's the same thing with being. If we look at vegetative life compared to rocks, or if we look at animal life compared to vegetative life, or if we look at humans who have free will and reason, and we compare them with the beasts, the brute animals, we see a trajectory. What does that point to? It points to supreme being. It points to God. This, again, is straight out of St. Anselm. I encourage you and everyone listening to read St. Anselm.
Yeah, I think he's going to go on my reading list. So I'm curious as to how you judge what is more perfect than something else. Is this your personal opinion as to what is more perfect?
I think we need to look at the nature of things. What is human nature? What is the nature of an apple? What is the nature of a tree? What is the nature of water? What is the nature of wood? What is the nature of an iPhone? What is it?
Well, these are all physical things you're talking about.
What is the nature of intelligence? What is the nature of free will? What is the nature of reason? What is the nature of justice? What is the nature of beauty? We can talk about intangibles and transcendence if you want. It's just easier to talk about the worm-eaten apple compared to the one that's fresh and wholesome and tastes good. I can see right away which one's more perfect.
So you can see perfection in one sense, and I may well see perfection in another sense. How do you determine which is more objectively perfect?
It's all about the final end, the final cause, it's called. What is the purpose? You and I can sit down in the tool shed and put together a shelf, okay? But your shelf, you take the screws and you pound them in with a hammer, and I take the perfect screwdriver that was made for that particular screw and I screw it into the wood. It does the same job, but you're kind of stripping the wood. You're not getting quite the same teeth into your screw because you're pounding it in with a hammer. You haven't respected the nature of the screw, the nature of the hammer, the nature of the wood. You need to understand what is the end, what is the purpose, what is the goal. This is called the final cause. And we need to know what is the nature of what we're dealing with here, whether it's a tangible thing or whether it's intangible. We need to know what is it, what is its nature, what is it designed for.
So it sounds like you're saying that objective perfection is teleologically determined?
Yeah, it's the end. It's about the end. What is the end?
So whose end? I was asking about objectivity, and you're talking about subjective determination.
Well, objectively, I am not you, right? For the sake of argument, let's just agree that I am not you. So your end, for me, is not subjective, it's objective. Your objective end, from your perspective, is subjective. But from my perspective, I'm looking at you across the ocean over the airwaves on this camera, and I can say that objectively, your end is to know God, to love God, and to serve God so that you can be happy with God forever in the next life. That is your end. It's objective.
So purpose is objective for everything. How do you know that that's true?
Walk through the implications, the logical implications of the negation of what I'm asserting, just for fun. Just walk through it and see what you encounter.
Let's pick an example. Let's say somebody designs a tool which has two purposes. Let's say like a hammer, for example, which can be used to hammer in a nail and pull a nail out. That has two different purposes. How do you determine objectively what the purpose is? Well, you determine by the person designing it, yes?
Well, if I'm hammering nails into my shelf, then I'll use the blunt side to hammer the nails in. And if I'm pulling apart a crate, I'll use the claw end and I'll pull the nails out. I mean, every situation has its unique needs, and you need to use the tool in the appropriate way for those needs. Does that answer the question, or have I completely missed your point?
It's hard to say because it's a complex thing. Maybe taking it back to basics. So you said the reason you know the God exists is because it's perfect, and that's the logical extension of perfection. And the way you tell how something is perfect is based on its purpose, its end. But then you said that is different for different people.
No. I would never say that two people have different ends. No, I would never say that. I mean,
two people give something different ends. So the purpose comes from a mind, would you say?
For sure.
So a mind assigns purpose, a mind assigns perfection because it sets the scale, does it not?
Everything, even the very bare existence of a grain of sand in this material universe, the only reason it exists is because it is in the mind of God. So the mind is everything. And if you think in Platonic terms, there's some modifications that would need to be made to the Platonic worldview, the world of forms and ideas, but there's a lot in common. And if you read St. Augustine, you'll see that there's a lot borrowed from Plato and from the Neoplatonists.
He was quite influential, yes.
Yeah, but that idea of the mind, I mean, it's so broad that you brought up this idea of the mind and intention and the final cause of things being dependent on a mind. Everything is.
So to me, a mind is something that physically exists. This is something where it's a pattern in time housed within some material. So, for example, our only examples of minds come from brains, from computer substrates, and so on. So how do you know that this mind can exist without matter?
Minds are supernatural. Minds are not natural.
Can you define supernatural?
Not natural.
It's not much of a definition.
Do you know what natural is?
So I would say existing within the universe?
Spatiotemporal, matter, energy. Matter and energy are one thing. This is Einstein's principle of equivalence, E equals mc squared.
Mm-hmm.
And space-time, the fabric of space-time, space and time cannot be separated.
So matter, energy, and space-time is natural, yeah?
Yeah, and, natural causality.
And supernatural is anything that doesn't exist within space-time?
I don't say it doesn't exist. My mind interacts with my brain. We are immaterial, supernatural soul, and we are also a natural body. But even the natural body is sustained by the supernatural. If you want to use an analogy with computer software, if there's no hardware, there can be no software. And God is the hardware, and the material universe and the natural is the software. There's a logical dependence there.
So if the supernatural is timeless, then no time has anything supernatural happened?
No. Grace does not destroy nature, it perfects nature, and it created and sustains nature. So when God wanted to create nature, this is St. Thomas Aquinas now, when God in his infinite wisdom created nature, he was not frustrated in his design. He wanted to create nature to be natural, and guess what? It's natural. He succeeded. He made nature natural.
So how do you know that minds are supernatural and not natural?
Well, I have firsthand experience with solipsism, which, like I said, might just be a mental aberration, but it's also an article of faith that the mind and the soul are not material. And it's something that we can know philosophically, because if the mind or if the soul are composed of parts and are subject to change, then we can't have the identity. This is something that I brought up with Graham Oppy when I interviewed him. I don't know if you know him. He's a famous atheist philosopher in Australia. But I gave him a paradox. I'd like to try it out on you, too. It is relevant. Do you mind?
Yeah, go for it.
It has to do with like a duplication machine where your name is Joel, right?
Yes.
So Joel gets into the duplication machine, and now there are two configurations of matter energy which are identical, or at least identical for that moment where the transaction was made. And so from that point forward, the clone version of you, or your twin, or whatever you want to call him, Joel number 2, right away starts diverging from you, because he, like, as your bodies separate, he has a different coordinate in space-time, and his thoughts probably will diverge from yours, and his history and your history will start to diverge from that moment in this duplication machine. But my point here with this thought experiment, I'd like to get your thoughts on it, is that if there is no supernatural, then you would have to admit that you are nothing more than that particular configuration of matter energy in space-time. And not only that, it gets even worse, because you are also that zygote, that human single cell that was fertilized in your mother's womb, assuming your mother was impregnated the old-fashioned way. But that is also you. So your physical configuration has been changing. It's much like that paradox of the ship that's being repaired one plank at a time until there are no original planks left in the ship. I don't know if you know about that one.
The one I know is the axe, where the head has been replaced and the shaft has been replaced, but it's still the ancient axe.
Yeah, so all kinds of paradoxes like that. But I'd like you to talk to me about this configuration of matter energy in space-time and what makes you, especially given the fact that you were that single-cell human zygote back in your mother's womb.
Yeah, I agree. People are configurations of matter and energy in space-time. That's what you are is the pattern. That's just the name you give to a pattern, which is a person, body and mind moving through space-time. I mean, if you were to duplicate somebody, they would start out as an identical replica. And let's say step it up one, where you say you take the original person and you duplicate them. I don't know if this is what you originally meant. You duplicate them into two identical positions. Then were there three people, two people, one person? Like, you know, the idea of the Star Trek teleporter, where they die every time they transfit. And then there's the potential series of ghosts behind them, or all the people who were destroyed at the point where they were disintegrated. There's a really good book called Kraken about that mentions that. But yeah, so I would say you are a pattern. I'm not sure I would go with the zygote thing, because usually you think of yourself as your mind, which is something that develops gradually as you grow. So you wouldn't have any subjectivity at a certain point. And then it's something that gradually builds as your brain increases in complexity, because what you are is sort of layers of subroutines that work against each other and build on each other.
Yeah. There's so many directions I'd love to go in, but I don't want to dominate. So
yeah, I was asking about supernaturalism, how you know the difference between something that is and isn't supernatural. You mentioned a few different things, philosophy. One of the things you said was faith. I'm curious about how that works. So you have faith that something is supernatural and that makes it supernatural? Or
no, the first leap of faith that we all have to make, whether we're conscious of it or not, and sadly most atheists I interact with are not conscious of having made the leap of faith, is out of solipsism into the material world, that it really does exist. Because there is absolutely no scientific or even philosophical basis for positing the existence of the material universe or the existence of the other. There is absolutely no basis for it. It has to be a leap of faith. It has to be. There is absolutely nothing we could do to verify these alleged sense perceptions that we have, because every empirical test involves those very sense perceptions that we are trying to establish.
Can you define faith in the sense that you're using it there? Or what exactly do you mean when you say that?
Faith is believing things without having certainty.
You mentioned faith as a reason for belief, but then you said faith means belief. How does that work?
Well, let's use the example of the naive realist atheist who says, well, of course I believe the real world is real. Let's get on with it, right? Maybe you've thought about it, maybe you haven't thought about it. Either way, you have committed. You have committed yourself to belief in the real world. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, so does commitment require 100% certainty, the absence of ability to change your mind? Is that what you mean by commitment?
No, of course not. No, as I told you at the outset, there is a negligible but non-zero probability that I would assign to the fact that I am, in fact, God. My apologetics approach is quite different from anyone else I've met, in as much as I use radical doubt always to go with my opponent, my intellectual opponent, those who are challenging my faith. I don't want to defend when someone attacks with introducing doubt. I want to go with them and go further and doubt everything that can be doubted, right back to the point where I'm all alone and I have to start from scratch, because that to me is the only way to build a solid foundation of faith, is by acknowledging that I took that very first leap of faith, that I am not God, that God is God, and that every atheist that I talk to takes that same leap minus one key ingredient. They don't address the issue of God, that being whose essence is existence. They don't acknowledge it. It's just like the Buddhists. The Buddhists don't acknowledge that. They say, don't ask that question. It's a stupid question. And the atheists do the same thing. But I think that's the most important question, because if you're putting your faith, which you are, in the real world, it seems completely absurd to not ask the question about existence itself.
Well, so I think we might have to go back to faith later, because the definition doesn't really fit the usage, if you see what I mean, where people give faith as a reason for belief, but you're effectively saying that faith is a belief. And we can go back to that. How do you know that those are the only two options, that there is the Catholic God or you're the only person in the universe?
Oh, because if there's a second candidate for God, then I just have to compare him with the real God. And if their infinite perfections all match, then they're not two, but one. And if the candidate for God lacks any of the perfections or differs from God in any way, then it's not God. It's very, very simple. This was resolved early in the church.
There aren't two options. There's more than two, but you seem to be stuck on only two options. So you were saying that you should have as much doubt as possible, but it seems that you're missing out on that piece of doubt there.
No, we need to doubt everything. And the one thing we can't doubt is I am, because when I deny that I am, I affirm that I am. Therefore, I am. I am. And that experience of confronting the fact of your existence, it's an apprehension. It's not a comprehension, because we can't comprehend eternity or God, but it's an apprehension with the mystery of existence. And I can tell you, like Spinoza said, I don't know if you're a fan of Spinoza, but he said, we feel and know that we are eternal. This is the sort, I was a pantheist for a while, so I can connect it with that, or I can connect it with Buddhism, or I can connect it with monotheism. I can connect it with anything. It's the bare fact of our existence. If you haven't been impressed by it, it's because your mind is distracted. You need to settle your mind and be confronted by the fact of your existence. And no amount of talking about this or asking me for definitions will substitute for the direct experience of confronting the bare fact of existence. So we won't get much progress here.
Oh no, I've done that plenty of times. It's fine. I have no problem with my existence, especially the knowledge that the universe existed before I did and will continue on after me. That's fine. That's plenty of evidence supporting that. But you're saying it's either you that's a god, or there's another god, but you're missing the third option where there are no gods. How do you know that that's not happening?
No, because what I've experienced, which you have apparently not experienced, not to denigrate your journey in any way, shape, or form, but what I've experienced that you have not experienced, apparently, because you're not a monotheist or you're not a heart solipsist, apparently you have not encountered this brute fact of existence, because when you're confronted in that way, you know that life is eternal. And this.
So it sounds like you're talking about fear, the fear of death, and then you believe that you're going to carry on because you're scared.
No, the confrontation with the raw fact of eternal existence, which you participate in, whether you're the source of it or not, it is frightening. It's more frightening than living in the naive realist worldview where your biggest concern is physical pleasure and advancing in the social ladder, or whatever it is that occupies people.
I'm not sure where you're getting eternal from. How do you know that existence is eternal?
As I've said before, and we probably should move on to other topics, unless you've had the existential, experiential confrontation with the fact of your own existence, you just won't get it.
So your worldview is driven by the fear of death?
You can say that. That's not my experience.
Is that a good reason to believe that something is objectively true, a subjective experience of feeling?
Well, I don't accept your claim that my confrontation with experience is the jumping off point based on fear into some irrational belief. Life is eternal. If you haven't seen that...
So you can't have experienced eternity, right?
Why not?
Because you're still here within time. So clearly you cannot have experienced all of time.
Well, that's like saying you can't have gone to the ocean because you didn't put all the ocean into a thimble.
No, you can go to the ocean, but I don't think you understand what eternity is.
No, you don't understand the difference between apprehending and comprehending. I can apprehend the ocean. I can't comprehend it. I can apprehend a grain of sand. I will never comprehend it. It's the same thing with eternity. When we apprehend and experience, come into contact with life itself as eternal, as Spinoza said, we know and feel that we are eternal. This is an experiential, existential thing.
So an experience is something that takes time. So you cannot have experienced eternity. That's not physically possible.
I can tell you the exact moment in time. Well, I don't know exactly when it was because I didn't mark the calendar, but I have in my memory the exact moment where I apprehended eternity and I apprehended God and I apprehended the mystery that is life eternal. I mean, we can keep dwelling on this. If you want to just poke fun and make fun of an experience that you've never had, that's fine. I don't mind. But we could probably pursue other aspects of this.
Well, it's just that you were saying that the God objectively exists, but then when we come down to it, it's a subjective experience that you personally have had.
Well, let's use the reduction to absurdity. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm just insane and I think that life is eternal based on some feelings and some arbitrary decisions I made, okay? Let's assume that I'm wrong and that you're right and there is no God. What would that mean? What does that say about life? What does that say about justice? What does that say about truth? It reduces everything to a very, very thin sandwich where the slices of bread are a cold, dead universe, right? And it's completely and utterly meaningless. There's no value. There's nothing.
So you think that meaning can only come from a God?
Of course. Life has to be eternal for morality to have any meaning, for anything we do to have meaning. You need...
So this is an argument from consequences rather than actually true.
I'm not making an argument. I'm just trying to ask you, what would happen if we denied my experiential apprehension of the fact that life is eternal? What would that look like?
Well, you say facts, but facts are objectively verifiable, and you're talking about a subjective experience.
I am 100% convinced that life is eternal. If I'm wrong, it doesn't matter, because what is a godless world like?
Well, let's say if you were wrong, then it would matter, because it would mean that you only have the short time you have here, which means that life would be more precious as a result. The things that have meaning have value and meaning specifically because they're not eternal, because they're transient.
Yeah, I agree with you that things have value and meaning by virtue of the fact that they're fleeting, they're fragile, they're not God. These things have value and meaning because of that. It's part of the beauty of being a creature, right? But I would challenge you to look at the life of an anonymous ancestor of yours and tell me how much value you see. What your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is to you, you are to future generations. And what that is a big fat zero. There's nothing there. There's absolutely no value that you can derive from that. Absolutely none. And it's the same. You are in exactly the same situation with respect to the people 1,500 years from now. Your life that you think is so valuable and meaningful is not. It's nothing.
So let's try reframing this way of thinking. Let's say that a person who's a peasant and a farmer and so on is living, and they think my life won't have any meaning and won't have any objective meaning unless I'm the king. Therefore, I must be the king. Is this fear and projection a real way of telling what's true and what's really there?
Do you acknowledge, first of all, that what you are to the person in the past, the person 1,500 years in the future is to you?
Well, you can only mean so much to people who haven't personally met you. Although you have read Plato, for example, so you do know that certain people, their ideas travel on through humanity.
I specified pick an anonymous one, right? I specified that for a reason. So this flips your argument around on you now, where you want to be a king, you want to be remembered, you want to make a mark, you want to be in the history books, you want to leave a trace like Plato did. Otherwise, you're just one of these anonymous peasants. So you think that you have to be a king to make your life meaningful. I don't, because life is eternal.
No, I was explaining how your reasoning is working, where if fear drives you to believe something, then you will end up believing things that don't necessarily actually exist. You will end up believing things that aren't true.
But what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Is it fear that drives you to want to leave a mark so that people can read about you in the future?
I suspect fear is a fair motivation. I think it's the most base motivation in humanity, actually. It's one of those things that drives everyone. Fear is the strongest motivator.
Right. So how much effort do you put into leaving a mark in this world for future generations?
Not that significant, to be honest. I don't think that I personally am going to make a huge difference. But then that's the point. You don't have to be single-handedly driving humanity forward. We do it collectively. Humans are a social species. We work together.
Yeah, but it's all for naught. That's the point. It will all, according to you...
According to who?
According to you, according to your worldview, there is no trace.
That would be according to you, because you're saying if humanity dies out, which all the evidence says it will eventually, then you have decided that means there's no meaning. It's a very pessimistic view.
No, in your worldview, when the heat death arrives, there are no YouTube videos to look at grandma's touching life story. There are no books to read about Plato. Your worldview is bleak. I would call it nihilism, because there is absolutely no morality, there's no meaning, and there's no lasting trace of anything having happened at all.
So if you don't personally like something, does that mean it doesn't exist?
Of course not.
So this is irrelevant.
It's all irrelevant. As soon as you started accusing me of having my whole worldview based on fear, it became irrelevant.
I was just bouncing off what you've been saying.
And I was just bouncing off what you're saying.
So you're going on your personal experiences, your fear of death.
Just like you are. Just like you are.
And this means that therefore something exists to make you have meaning.
I'm happy to go with your worldview. Let's say that you're right. Okay. That doesn't remove my fear. Does it remove your fear?
Oh, no, of course. You can't remove fear. I mean, Buddhists have given it a go. But no, it's something ingrained into you, because if you didn't fear death, you wouldn't eat, for example. So fear is something that you will have for your entire life. So you said that morality comes from the God, presumably. You said that nihilistic or humanist worldview and so on has no basis for morality. Can I ask you to define what morality actually is?
Lasting consequences for choices freely made.
So there's no difference between morality and immorality then?
Immorality leads you to hell and morality leads you to heaven.
So morality relies on supernatural places?
Everything does.
So that
Everything
would
does.
mean only humans can have morality in that worldview?
Only humans and angels.
So an animal that murders other animals and so on would just go to animal heaven?
There's no murder in the animal kingdom.
Chimpanzees actually conduct warfare, for example. They'll go off and murder the rest of the tribe and take their women and kill their babies and so on. This is something that doesn't just happen in human apes. It happens in other apes as well.
Your interpretation of the behavior of animals, the lower animals, is different from my interpretation. I see animals as having, as Aristotle said, they do have a soul. It's just not a rational soul. There's no free will.
So what's the difference between a moral act and an immoral act?
To understand morality, we need some basic definitions. First of all, we'll start with good and evil. Good is that which has being. As we move up on the scale of being, we're also moving up on the scale of goodness. You understand?
So, for example, would you put a human as having more being than a dog?
Yes.
So any given human is better than any given dog?
Yes.
So like the most immoral human would be better than the most moral dog?
Well, there is no morality among dogs. It's the morality that makes the human more real and therefore more good.
So can you give me an example of a moral human and an immoral human and tell me the difference?
If we participate willingly in all the perfections, we strive for the perfections, health, justice, beauty, and goodness itself, that's moral. And when we do the opposite, when we choose lesser goods, for example, if there are two children with two cookies, the cookie is good. Eating the cookie is good. Maybe we should use broccoli instead, but I don't think kids would fight over broccoli. But if the one child took both cookies for himself, that is good. Everything about it is good. But it's even better to share. Do you understand? I mean, this sounds like a really corny Mary Poppins lesson I just gave you. But it's better. I think you'll agree it's better to share, right?
Yeah, so cooperation would be a moral thing, for example, because it increases the well-being of the whole.
I don't think that you and I disagree about morality, but the problem is that your morality doesn't have any philosophical basis. That's the problem.
What would you consider a philosophical basis?
A difference between the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for any given human being based on the choices he makes. So the worst human that ever lived that made the worst set of possible choices in terms of morality has exactly the same outcome as the best saint that ever lived and made all the best possible choices, morally speaking, his whole life. So there is absolutely no difference in outcome in your worldview. Therefore, there's no basis for morality. If I live in your world, I'm just going to try to get away with whatever I can, maximize my own benefit, my own pleasure, my own well-being. And that includes sophisticated things like having a good reputation and having everyone think that I'm an upstanding citizen and that I'm moral and that I'm not kidnapping girls and raping them and killing them in my basement, right?
So you're saying you want to rape girls?
I'm saying there's absolutely no deterrent philosophically. There is absolutely no basis for morality because it actually doesn't matter what you do. And as I told you, in the Catholic definition of the good, everything that happens in the, for example, abduction, torture, rape, and murder of, let's say, a child, everything about that is good. It's just done in a way that is evil. Evil is not a thing, it's a way. Everything we choose is by nature if it's a thing, it's a good thing. So the pleasure I derive, the strength I get from drinking her blood, whatever it is, it's all good. Everything about it is good. That's the difference between Catholic morality and atheist morality. Atheist morality tends to classify people as some people are monsters and they're untouchables, like the pedophile priests, and other people are more acceptable. They seem to be like different classes of human beings. For the Catholic, we're all in the same boat. We're all choosing goods, but some of us choose goods in a way that is evil, and that is damnable. When you willingly choose a lesser good over a higher good, that is a damnable sin, and you are in danger of eternal damnation. Whereas in your worldview, if someone's a sophisticated, sick, pedophile pervert, as long as he can get away with it, he is getting more pleasure and a better reputation and everything else than just the regular schmuck who's trying to do the right thing.
Yep, some people do get away with it. That's why we try and improve on the justice system. I would argue with the idea that there is a atheist morality. There isn't. It's just atheism is just not believing in gods. There's no inherent morality with that. People pick up their own worldviews, and so I think secular humanism has a reasonable. And there's a lot of vestigial philosophy out there as well. But atheism, by definition, doesn't have any morality associated with it.
Well, if you're into seeing patterns in reality, I think you will see a pattern that it all has to do with quality of life, and it all has to do with a social contract. We will curb your behavior. If we think that your behavior is harmful, we will curb your behavior. This is the dominant morality of the atheist. I've never encountered anything but that. It's all based on might makes right, finally, right?
Oh, in the sense that the majority tend to take precedence over, the individuals. So in the sense that if everyone was a pacifist, then one psychopath could murder the entire world. Yeah, obviously try and keep people in check. It's just that I'm not sure I understand the punishment system of hell. So the idea is that you do whatever you want in life, and then you pay for it after you die.
The basic idea is that some people love themselves unto contempt of God, whereas we're supposed to love God unto contempt of self. So those who love self unto contempt of God are oriented away from the fire that is God's love. And that orientation does get the label hell. It's an orientation away from God, where the fire in the afterlife is unpleasant, to put it mildly. And whereas my orientation as someone that fears God and loves God and is striving to serve God, my orientation makes my relationship with that fire, which is the love of God, a pleasant one, orgasmic, ecstatic, infinitely fulfilling and joyful and pleasurable eternity with God, because I'm oriented in the proper way. This, again, comes back to human nature, what we are designed for, what our final end is, and all this sort of thing. So hell is a merciful falling away from the fire of heaven. The last thing that people burning in hell would want is to turn around, face God, and go up towards heaven. And when I say up, I'm just speaking metaphorically. But the last thing they would want is to be closer to that fire, to be in heaven. It's a mercy for those who hate God to be able to run away from God or to fall away from God. And in God's mercy, they are able to flee from heaven, flee from God, because heaven just is the presence of God. There's only one reality. It's fire. It's the fire of God's love. So heaven is that fire, hell is that fire, and purgatory is that fire too. So this idea of a big bully in the sky torturing people, that's just childish. It completely misses the point.
I get different answers from different people, and none of them can tell me how they know that.
Very mysterious.
Yeah.
You flashed your Anton LaVey there. Can you just talk a little bit about your involvement in that or your interest in that?
Oh, it was just on my reading list. I read it recently. It was an interesting book, but I consider I think that the psychology in it is a little bit outdated. Some of the mysticism in it, I don't really agree with. So the idea of letting your emotions run wild, sort of having a release in terms of the satanic rituals and so on, I can see why some people that would appeal to them, but I think it's based on outdated psychology, the idea that you can release all your energies and then walk out into life just free and feeling less concerned about things. So it's akin to having punching dummies for children, the idea that it does actually make them more aggressive and it makes them turn towards violence more quickly. So I don't think I agree with that approach. But I would have to ask psychologists before going any further into that. But yeah, so some of the, You make some really good points about the manipulation tactics used by priests and people from various religions trying to get money out of people and all that. And I'm sure you've seen that in many religions. So I think it was worth a read, but I think it was quite simplistic in terms of a worldview, and I don't think it's for me.
Yeah, I didn't take it too seriously, but I don't think that Anton LaVey himself took it seriously either.
No, it says there are several caveats within the book where it says some of this is fiction and some of this is real, and you have to be able to tell the difference.
Fun stuff. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming. It's been fun.
Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
End this one off. Thanks very much, everybody. Cheers.
Bye.